Hello, I'm Rita Van Zant. I'm here with the Bookfest, the Blue Ridge Bookfest, and we have the opportunity to talk to a wonderful author today. His name is Peter Deutermann, and I'm not going to give you a lot of the background for his naval life, but I thought I might just hit a couple of the highlights because some of the books he writes about are naval history books, and so he was in the naval U.S. Navy for 26 years, active duty. He got 19 military awards. I'm sure there's a whole story behind every one of them. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, was in Vietnam for quite a while, Pentagon, United Nations. I won't ask you which was harder, Vietnam or the Pentagon, but anyway. Well, and then also worked with arms control with USSR in Geneva. So how does somebody who does all of that end up being a fictional writer in Western North Carolina? How does that happen?
How does that happen? When
There's no water anywhere close.
Well, actually, there's enough water.
Okay.
They used to say for people in the Navy when they retired, how do you know when you found the place? And you put an oar over your shoulder and you walk inland and finally somebody says, "What's that?" You're there.
I love that.
We ended up in North Carolina after 13 years in Georgia. And I just wanted to live in a state that was a little bit more forward-looking. North Carolina tends to look ahead. Georgia tends to look back.
That's true.
And that really was the impetus for coming up here. I was researching a book, looked around the Greensboro area, and I'd always thought Greensboro was a truck stop. I'd never been off the interstate. It's a lovely city. There's everything there. We bought a farm about 25 minutes outside of town, and we just really love it. It's called the Piedmont Triad area, and it's all hardwoods, great big oak trees.
Oh,
I'm a tree nut. I like my trees, and in Georgia it was all pines.
Well, was that after you'd already started writing some fiction
Yes.
books?
I got out of the Navy, or left active duty, and wrote my first book, and then realized that I didn't know the first thing about selling it, getting it to publishers. I didn't know really what to do. My wife was in a courtroom one day. She'd gone to basically hold the hand of somebody who had to testify, who was very, very nervous about it. And they spent a lot of time in the waiting room, and sitting next to her was the publisher of the George Mason University Press.
Oh, my goodness.
And he said, being a university press, I have to publish an awful lot of esoteric stuff that doesn't make any money. So I'm always a cost center at the university. I'd love to find a piece of fiction. And she said, stop right there. Went out to the car, got the manuscript, handed it to him, and I had a publisher.
Oh my gosh.
Just
well,
like that.
So when somebody comes up and says, how do I get published? You say, send your wife to the car. No.
She's a salesman. I'm not.
Well, and so was that Scorpion in the Sea?
Scorpion in the Sea, that's correct.
Okay. And did you like it? Was it a complete package when she handed it to him? Or
Yes.
So you didn't have to edit it or do that much?
Well, I'd
effort?
worked on it for a couple of years, which is a long time for my kind of writing, which is suspense novels. It needed editing, and they didn't do very much editing. But what it did accomplish when once the hardback came out, the publisher, knew an agent in New York City. And he sent the book up there looking for a paperback deal. The agent called me and said, do you want to do this for a living? I said, yeah, that's the objective. He said, okay, I'll get back to you. What's your name? He was gone. I didn't actually know his name. He called back and he said, some editors are going to call you about your next 2 books. And I said, my next 2 books? He said, you got 2 more books in you, don't you? Yeah. You ready to talk about them? Absolutely. As soon as I think of them, you know. And editors called, and then this agent called back and he said, we have you in an auction. And I said, all right, one more time, what's your name? And he told me. I said, are you my agent? He said, if you want me to be your agent, how does this work? So he explained agenting to me. And basically, it was a handshake. As long as you produce material that I think is fit to sell into the market, I will keep you. As long as I produce deals which keep you in house and home, you will keep me. I can fire you, you can fire me. That's the deal.
Wow.
I said, great. And we operated on that deal, now 20 years now, but for the first 2 years without ever having physically met.
I'll be darned.
He put me in an auction. St. Martin's won the auction. I got a 2-book deal and was off and running. And that's not the typical way you get into the business. So when people say, how do you do this? I think it's struck by lightning, because it was about that fast.
And did you continue with the naval theme then for a while?
Sort of. It was more the Washington theme.
I see.
The second book was a Vietnam Navy book, and then into Washington, D.C., where I'd spent a lot of time. And then I just picked bureaucracies to work within, the FBI, some intelligence organizations, some Navy criminal organizations, criminal investigative organizations, things like that.
Well, I have to admit, when I first was introduced to you, I was looking for an audio book and went to Dick Hill and saw that the library here had 4 of your books on audio. And I thought, well, I don't know anything about him, but I'll start listening. And I just fell in love with your stories about North Carolina.
Yeah, those were fun.
And I guess I thought that you were raised in North Carolina. You know, I didn't even think about that you had been off on the Navy and everything, because they really weren't naval
not at all.
themes at all.
Law enforcement.
Was that after you moved to North Carolina that you did
Well,
those?
the book that I was researching, one of the things I was doing early in my career was I would like to set books in places I hadn't been.
I see.
So that I could go there. I did a
okay.
book on trains. You know, every kid likes trains. I had to research trains for about 4 months. I didn't know anything about trains, how they work, who controls them. Is there like a flight control center somewhere? There is. And it's fascinating. And so finally the publisher said, you ready to start? Oh, yeah, you want a book? Yeah, right. Okay, I'm ready to start, because I could have done that for a year.
Sure.
It was just interesting.
Who's your audience?
It's pretty eclectic. Military people like the military stuff. Anybody who's ever been in a bureaucracy loves the Washington stuff, because that's really what it's all about. Bureaucrats battling bureaucrats over things that don't seem important to ordinary citizens, but it's very important to a bureaucrat.
Right.
And then the Carolina books were aimed at Carolina. And again, fun research. I had to go all over the state and actually see North Carolina,
Right.
which has a tapestry of environments that is hard to beat on the East Coast.
Well, and I must admit, several people like your books in North Carolina because of the dogs that are in it.
Yeah.
Now, you want to tell the dogs' names?
Well, it depends. I've got 4 shepherds now. And I haven't, that's 3 or 4 books ago.
Okay, well, it's Frick, Frack,
Frick and Frack.
and then Kitty.
Kitty. Kitty, my daughter had a German shepherd, and she named it Kitty. And the idea was if somebody confronted her or she was afraid of something, she'd say, here, Kitty, Kitty, and here came this 100-pound shepherd jumping over the fence to come see what the problem was.
Great idea. I love
is.
it. And Cam Richter was your main character.
Right.
And he has had a detective agency kind of thing called Hide and Seek. So you're very clever with words, I think, to come up with
Well, people have told me I'm a certain kind of artist, and have been all my life. Words, it's our stock and trade.
Right. Well, now I want to shift over to Pacific Glory, because that's your big book that's so popular with so many people now. Yeah. It's actually between Guadalcanal and Mayday, right? That's kind of how it took place?
It is...
Midway, I mean.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it's
Midway.
the story of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. That is the setting. And the story is about a young man who is assigned as a ship's assistant department head when the book begins, and ends up through events becoming the captain of a destroyer 2 years later, as that destroyer goes unknowingly into the biggest naval battle of the Second World War.
It made me realize as I was reading it, once again, how little we know about the Pacific Front during World War II, most of us. We know, a lot of us know about the European front.
Right.
But the Pacific Front, I just don't think has ever been given the movie, the book, any of those storylines that where people could become more familiar with it. Unless you had a loved one who served there, and a lot of them didn't talk about it when they came home.
That's correct.
I really don't think that a lot of Americans know the whole story of all the different battles and everything.
The scene is so large, you know, it takes 3 weeks to sail a ship from San Diego out to the Philippine Islands.
Right.
People don't comprehend that it's thousands and thousands of miles between everything,
Right.
basically. And the scale of that conflict was enormous. That was a world war on its own.
Absolutely.
And by strategy, it was deliberately so, because the people in Washington felt that the more crucial threat was Hitler's Germany.
Yes.
The Japanese had done to us about all they were going to do to us, especially after Midway, and that was only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, where we hit them on the chin hard enough to convince them, don't go back there. They still owned the rest of Asia, and we were not invited out there either. But there were thousands and thousands of miles between
And stories.
Yes.
So many of the, excuse me, the stories that I'm even familiar with was a group of people being landed on an island and trying to figure out, what the heck am I doing here? How are we going to do all this? And then the Navy doing the same thing, trying to figure out where to put the fleet. You can't turn a fleet around very quickly to go anyplace.
No.
And they really decided to take the battle to the Japanese, didn't they?
Yeah.
Well, and so Pacific Glory starts in Pearl Harbor, right? The story.
It starts at the Battle of Guadalcanal, really.
Okay.
Pearl Harbor has happened.
Okay.
Just happened. They went into Guadalcanal in 42, and they were winging it. They were really winging it. And we'd lost a lot of capital ships at Pearl Harbor, hadn't lost any carriers. And one of the big stories of World War II was the fact that the battleship, which had been the Queen of the Seas, was no longer the Queen of the Seas. The carrier was. And because the carrier could project power 200 miles away and never see the other guy. Hopefully you never did see the other guy until you sank him. But because all our battleships were destroyed, we set to building carriers. The Japanese still had all their battleships, and they were still the Queen of the Seas. And for a lot of the war, they kept seeking the Titanic battle, the ultimate battle where they would defeat the American fleet once and for all, and then be the supreme conquerors of the Pacific. There were these pesky aircraft carriers that kept knocking them off, and the submarines kept knocking them off. And it took them 3 years, and by then it was too late, to recognize that the forces the Americans were bringing were not going to be defeated by battleships. And in fact, they'd lost so many ships, they were not going to be defeated at all. They knew how this was going to end.
Well, and in the battle that you really write about, the two largest battleships the Japanese had played into that, right?
Yes, they did, and one was sunk en route to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. That was the Musashi. The Yamato was her sister ship. She was sunk late in the war when the Americans were invading Okinawa. This is summer of 45. And she was sent as a kamikaze. This is an 80,000-ton battleship with 3,000 people on board. She was sent with 3 little destroyers to go down to Okinawa, run herself aground, and duke it out with the 270 ships we had surrounding Okinawa. And she never got there.
And that's how ineffective those battleships were by that time.
They couldn't confront 200-300 airplanes that came in waves.
Well, now, to make this story good, it's not just the Navy history.
Right.
You had to bring some characters in who are wonderful characters. So tell a little bit about, well, there were 3 men and 1 woman that kind of are the main people.
Yeah, 1 ghost.
Yeah, right.
2 serving officers and the widow of the ghost, if you will. She's a Navy nurse in Pearl. And Pearl, for a lot of the war, was the place where the ships went back to. They'd go out on the line for 90 days or 100 days. They'd come back to Pearl, lick their wounds, get repairs, get new people, get rid of old people, wounded people. So Pearl was home base until 45 when everything moved forward and closer to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So she is there. One of the characters is this young officer who finds himself thrust into command about a week before the Battle of Leyte Gulf of a destroyer. He is very junior, he is very inexperienced, but he rises to the occasion, as those people did. And then the other fellow is an aviator who has a bumpy ride. He's a very good attack aviator. He's not a very good naval officer, drinks a lot, gets in trouble, chases skirt, typical pilot, you know, I mean, that's the way they view themselves. Professional enough to land bombs on carriers at Midway, but a little bit of a thorn in the side of the white glove Navy, if you will.
I don't imagine these characters are based on true people, but did you get examples of those kind of ace pilots who, what do they say, have nothing left to lose, and so they're willing to go out there and fight the battle that a lot of pilots would say, I'm not going out, I'd send somebody else?
Most of the Navy pilots, they take the option away of saying, I'm not going to go out there, because they launch you off a carrier and then the carrier drives away. So you might as well go out there and do your business.
Right.
You know, that's not the problem. The problem comes when you take a squadron of 24 attack planes out to hit a carrier, and one of the guys won't play by the rules. One of the guys sees a target and lunges after it. That's unprofessional. He may get the target. He's got murder on his mind and he succeeds. But he screws up the plan, and if his plane gets hurt or damaged, when they all get back to the carrier, he's got to land first. And the other guys might be low on fuel, so they got to wait. And they may have to ditch because this hotshot wouldn't play by the rules. So there are guys like that, you know, and they're useful in a fight, but not for much else.
There are so many women that I found that love Pacific Glory, and there are a lot of battles. There are lots of descriptions of things like that. So I think that says something about your writing, that you can make it so clear and so exciting that not just the men who maybe were in the Navy or whatever, or might want to read about it, but women also really enjoyed this book.
Well, it's that takes time to learn how to do. As military guys, we're used to putting every last bloody detail into anything we write, so as not to be accused of having left something out.
Right.
My second book was called The Edge of Honor. It was a book about Vietnam. It had a glossary.
Oh my goodness.
And that's something that puts women off, in particular if it's that technical, that much stuff that I need a glossary. I don't know if I'm going to do that. So I learned after that, don't make it necessary to have a glossary. And there are techniques for that. If military people speak in an argot of abbreviations, NCIS, you know, you don't say Naval Criminal Investigative Service, you say NCIS. So what you have to do is in dialogue, have somebody explain what NCIS means. You would have a character say, I'm going to call in the NCIS. You would have a civilian character in the room say, what's that? Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Oh.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
And then that
now
helps
the reader's
the reader. Right.
Right.
Now that battle, the final one that I love so much, they called it Halsey's Blunder. Also one of the most heroic feats of the history of the Navy. Are they studying it at the U.S. Naval Academy?
Not at the Academy. That scale of a war fight is studied at the Naval War College.
I see. So they might be reading your book as well as actually looking at the history.
Sure. I mean, it's been studied to death, really. And yet, we think we know everything. There have been two books that just came out on the Battle of Midway recently. One, two scholars went and talked to the Japanese about the Battle of Midway.
Smart.
They went and talked to some of the pilots, Japanese pilots, to the engineers on the 4 carriers that were sunk, 4 Japanese carriers that were put down. There is this myth that the American Navy caught them in the middle of refueling all their airplanes, and therefore were able to set the carriers on fire. because they caught them with this huge vulnerability. That's not what happened.
Wow, and they're just finding that out now after that long a time.
Everybody
Wow.
knows that.
Wow. Wow.
No, everybody's wrong. These guys went and talked to the Japanese. In fact, there were 2 books written in Japan 20 years ago about the Battle of Midway that American scholars just missed.
Wow.
How many read Japanese?
So the history is a truth to somebody, not necessarily the truth.
Right. Written by the victor.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, of course. Yes.
And when those carriers went down, they took thousands of people with them.
Yes.
When the destroyers went down at Leyte Gulf, they didn't go look for them, for survivors, because how could there be any survivors when 3 destroyers went up against Yamato, Kongo, Haruna, all these giant ships?
Right.
You go to my website, there's pictures of these ships attached to the bit about Pacific Glory. You can see them.
Right. Well, the one thing that I wanted to have on Pacific Glory in the on the front cover was a map.
Yeah.
And I actually thought on your website, which is a wonderful website, by the way, if people want to go look P.T. Deutermann, they can see it. I really think that a map helps. So I went, thank God for Google, went and looked it all up. But maybe other people know about it, but I just didn't know about it.
We thought about putting it inside the cover.
Front jacket, yeah.
And I like that personally. I love maps. It's expensive. And again, the marketeers feel that, if you got to have a map, it's like you got to have a glossary. This is too hard.
Maybe paperback or something later on, or I'll put but anyway, like I said, Google really helps when you're reading a book like this, I think. Okay, let's go to your next book, because I know you have a book coming out that, again, there's no water around it other than the Dead Sea.
The Dead Sea, yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your next book.
It's set in Israel in contemporary times, with an introduction in the time of the Jewish revolt against Rome in 67 AD at a fortress called Masada. Masada was one of King Herod's refuges. Since he was not a Jew, he was an Idumean, he had refuge fortresses built throughout his kingdom where he could run to if the Jews revolted against him and were about to win. Masada was one of them. It's down on the Dead Sea. It overlooks the Dead Sea. It is this mesa that stands 1,000 feet up from the shores of the Dead Sea. And it had palaces, storerooms, defenses, cisterns, good for 40 to 50 years of survival up there with his entire retinue and family. So if somebody came after Herod, he could go up there. It was impregnable in the 1st century, or so he thought.
He thought, you're right.
But it wasn't. And the Roman war machine, after they crushed the revolt in 67 AD, went down to find the remnants of the rebels who had occupied Herod's fortress and were holding out. They thought they could hold out for 40 years. They held out for almost 3. And then they were overcome, and rather than be captured and become slaves of the Roman army, they all killed themselves. 960 men, women, and children killed themselves rather than submit to the Romans.
Well, now, I think it's true that Jewish faith doesn't allow suicide, so they couldn't let everybody commit suicide, so how did they do that?
They first of all, they instructed the head of every family, because the surviving rebels from the Battle of Jerusalem had gone down there with their families. Father had to slay mother and kids.
Right.
Then they drew lots for 10 men to go around and kill all the fathers. Then they drew lots again for one guy to go around and kill the 10, and then himself.
So there was only one suicide, all the rest were murdered.
Last man had to commit suicide.
Wow. And all right, so I've heard that there are books about this before, but you've got a twist to it.
Right.
You didn't stay in the past.
No. I introduce what actually happened there, and then I bring it forward, and a guy has a theory that there was another reason why they committed suicide, that these Jews, who were zealots and who were tough guys, the Apaches of their day, if you will, were protecting something on the mountain.
I love this idea.
All right, and that's all I'm going to tell you.
Oh, Tune in. Well, now when does the book comes out in
Next week.
2012?
Next
All right.
week.
So, and what's the name of it?
The Last Man.
Which is very appropriate,
Yes, it
then,
is.
isn't it? Well, and if people have ever been to Masada, they know it does feel impenetrable.
Yes.
And yet, I assume that he goes up and wanders around and sees what's going on.
Yeah.
Right?
What the Romans did was they looked at the 1,000-foot high walls and said, can't do that. Went around to the other side and realized that because of the topography, if they built a ramp, they could walk up. Now, when you see the size of the mountain and think of the size of the ramp, that's a big ramp.
Right.
It's still there.
And also, I thought about the people standing there watching them build that every day.
Not only that, but they used prisoners, women prisoners, that they'd taken from Jerusalem, which is 40, 50 miles away. These women would have to carry an amphora of water on their backs from Jerusalem, or the nearest wells, to the Roman army, refill the water stores there. Then they would work there for a day, taking the same amphora, filling it with sand and dumping it in the gully.
Oh my gosh.
To make the ramp.
Right.
Under the theory that the Jews up on top of the mountain would not shoot arrows at their own women.
I'd never heard that story before.
And that's how they did it. It took 3 years.
Well, now let's talk just a final minute about the social media, internet. I know that writing isn't just writing a book, and you have to really market it. How do you think that your website helps you as an author?
It tells people without their having to walk up to the author, which people are sometimes fain to do because they think they got to buy a book.
Right.
What the books are about, what my background is and qualifications to write them, and they get a look at them and see how many and where they can get them.
And also, you have, like you said, pictures and so forth. So it brings the book to life in a different way that maybe you couldn't do by the publishing itself. Will Masada, or will The Last Man also have some pictures?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, I'm going to accompany those as well because, you know, you used to make jokes about guys who couldn't read very well. I'm sorry there are no pictures in this book, but it's a visual nation.
Yes, absolutely.
And so pictures work.
And you have a wonderful website, by the way.
Wonderful webmaster.
Yeah. Well, there again, you know who to ask.
Yes.
Well, I really appreciate you coming in today. Because I've read your books, I knew that you would be a great person to talk to, and I was right. Thank you for coming, and thank you for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. This is Rita Van Zant. Goodbye.